Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third webinar of the web series, Navigating the Unseen. My name is Fiona Way, and I'm an organisational psychologist and Managing Director of Adaptive Psychology. And partnering with me on screen today actually is we have Heidi Turble, the team leader in the Work Environment Unit in Technical Services from SafeWork SA. Just want to give us a wave there, Heidi. It's lovely to see so many familiar names popping up on screen today, so thank you for joining us again. And also see lots of new names, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all as well. Now, before we launch into the session outline, I'd just like to pause for a moment to acknowledge that the lands we are presenting from today are the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I just wanted to talk you through how we're going to capture any questions you might have for us during the session. So due to the short time frame that we have and the number of people online with us, we have set up a Slido to capture all of your questions. So either scan in with your phone via the QR code we have on screen, or follow the web link and enter the details to access the Slido. And here you'll be able to ask your question or vote for a question that you've seen someone else ask. And at the end of the webinar, Heidi and I will try and get through as many questions as we can, starting from the top voted questions and work our way down. And if there are any questions which may be outside of our ability to answer, we will come back to the group through another avenue to provide a response. I'd also like to introduce you to Rebecca as well, who will be providing support if you have any technical difficulties at all. So please just message her directly and she will try to assist. Okay, so just as a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. So I'll be excited about this, but I'll be presenting to you all a new iteration of the hierarchy of control and how redesign, we'll talk about how the redesign fits into this hierarchy. And we'll also demystify what job redesign is and what it actually involves. And just to make sure everyone is on the same page, I'm also going to do a very quick refresh on the common psychosocial hazards before we then share some case studies and examples of how organisations have successfully applied redesign as a control to identify psychosocial hazards. And we'll also be hearing from Heidi, so the regulator's perspective on redesign and what they look for when investigating the management of psychosocial hazards in workplaces. Now, taking on board feedback from previous webinars as well, we have tried to add a bit more detail to the slides to support people who learn and process information visually. And we'll also be making the slides and recording of this webinar available to the public as well, so don't feel the need to take copious amounts of notes. Right. So super excited about this. It did take me a while to format it, but I'm really excited to share this new iteration of the hierarchy of control. Now, you might remember from the previous webinar that I presented you all with a different version of the hierarchy that made it a bit more applicable to the management of psychosocial hazards. So now ensuring that we are capturing both physical and psychosocial hazards under the hierarchy of control, and for those of you who are still needing to actually reference that in your line of work, made an attempt to combine both. So on the left-hand side, you have the traditional eliminate, substitute, isolate and engineer administrative controls and PPE for physical hazards. And on the right-hand side, we have controls at the top tier, which are also eliminate, so controls to remove psychosocial hazards and to eliminate psychological harm to workers. And then we have redesign, which aims to remove or minimise risk by redesigning how the work is done. Then we have adapt, which are controls aimed at minimising psychosocial risks through adjustments to things like work environment, work practices, adjusting resources versus the demands, or substituting tasks. And then beneath that, we have educate, which are controls aimed at upskilling and training workers to understand their roles and responsibilities, the policy, the process, the expectations. And then lastly, we have encourage, which are controls aimed at promoting participation and encouraging personal change. Now, the three top tiers are controls aimed at changing the environment and the work. which are much more effective controls than the bottom two, which are aimed at changing the worker. And based on feedback out in the field, I'm getting the sense that eliminate, adapt, educate, encourage are controls that are relatively straightforward, which is why today we'll be spending time on better understanding what the control redesign looks like in practice. But before we explain what work redesign is, Heidi's actually going to talk us through what work design is. So over to you, Heidi.
Great, thanks, Fiona. So work design as a concept, it might be called work design or job design, depending where you sit, but it's really referring to the content and the organisation of work tasks, the activities of work and the relationships that we have and responsibilities to do with a defined role. So if we're looking at anything from the physical elements of the work tasks that are performed by work, the emotional, the cognitive demands that are involved in performing work activities, and then looking at those relationships of different individuals and work teams working together within an organisation. So that's fundamentally a nice definition. If we're looking also then at the fact that work design is a process. So it's a process in that it involves understanding what the context of your work is as an organisation, the strategic goals that it's wanting to achieve, and also balancing those with employee needs as well. And ultimately, it's aiming to ensure that we're removing as many obstacles as possible that could hinder productivity and promote well-being, whilst also trying to achieve an organisation's goal. So if you can imagine, I'll give some examples of maybe three different types of, very different types of jobs. We could be working in an organisation that's fundamentally a customer service type role delivery. It could be retail or a call centre or a help desk or those types of things. They're going to be certain types of customer service type requirements expected in the delivery of those services in that design. That could be very different from working in a scientific field, such as a laboratory environment where quality control and, having precise methodologies in the way that you're delivering or performing your work task could be implemented. They'll be very different as well. And then lastly, I'm thinking of maybe like a project manager role where there are deliverables of a project, there's time restraints, there's needing to engage with lots of different stakeholders to try to achieve the outcome. All those different types of roles have different elements of work design associated with them, which vary considerably. So if we go down to looking at work context itself, it's really looking at your organisation, the environment in which it's operating in. So we might look at aspects of the organisational structure. Is your organisation quite hierarchical with multiple tiers and multiple different elements of work teams or sub-departments within it? Or is it a quite flat structure where you've got lots of people doing the same types of tasks fundamentally? Are there any other external pressures on it? Are there political pressures? Are there board oversight that we need to meet or focus on key KPIs as an organisation that's driving what you do? If we're looking at the skills of the employees or workers there, are they fundamentally younger or maybe not as experienced? Are there an ageing workforce? Is there a lot of high turnover where there could be knowledge loss within your organisation? These are all sort of contextual things that we need to consider. And then if we're looking at the resources that are available to staff, now these can be resources by way of how many staff there are, but also the resources that are available for them to do their jobs, such as their IT equipment. What's the condition of those equipment? Are they fit for purpose? And then lastly, I suppose we're looking at what is the current physical and psychosocial hazards that are in place within your organisation that you've been able to identify, and how effective do you feel that your current control measures are in trying to address those hazards in place. So I suppose I would look in terms of getting you to reflect on your own work organisation's context. It's really taking a snapshot of your organisation and saying, what are some of the key drivers, the values, and maybe considering how risk averse your organisation is. If you spoke to your staff, would they be saying that they're really engaged in the work that they perform? And then also whether you could, really consider how you're rating your own psychosocial safety climate. How safe do people feel about speaking up about concerns that they have within an organisation and, I suppose, challenging the status quo in doing things? So, Fiona, I'm going to flick it back to you now to talk about what work redesign is.
Thank you, Heidi, for that robust explanation on work design. So now that we have a better understanding of work design, of what work design is, work redesign is really operating on the premise that there is already some form of work design and that there is an opportunity to make it more effective, for whatever reason that might be for the organisation. Now, although work redesign can be applied in an organisation for a broad variety of reasons, today we're actually going to talk about work redesign in the context of mitigating psychosocial risk. So what opportunities are there to actually minimize or even design out psychological hazards? So with that in mind, work redesign as a control measure refers to the intentional restructuring or rethinking of work tasks, processes, and roles within an organization with the intention of improving safety, well-being, and I suppose ultimately productivity as well. So really effective work design or redesign processes uses systems thinking to understand what factors are supporting or diminishing the effectiveness of any current controls that might already be in place. So the premise behind systems thinking is you're working your way back to the root cause of the problem to nip it in the bud. And good work design or redesign is really underpinned by systems thinking and aims to remove issues from the cause by designing out the psychosocial hazards and risks. So what does that process involve? Now, work redesign is a methodical and structured process. And of course, with every great process, there is an even prettier diagram. So let's refer to the diagram while I step through it. So the first step is really to understand your workplace and its context. So what Heidi was talking about before, which includes both internal and external factors impacting on the work. Then it's about identifying what psychosocial hazards are prevalent in your workplace that you need to mitigate. The next step is the actual redesign component, where you work backwards to determine the source or root cause of the hazard and consider how you can restructure and reallocate tasks to eliminate inefficiencies, improve communication, build psychological safety and trust, and improve workplace culture. And of course, the most beneficial way to do this is to ensure you co-create this with your employees to increase buy-in to the changes. And you know what? It's likely that they might even come up with the best ideas to mitigate the problem. But it doesn't stop there. So once you've essentially designed the redesign, there is the process of consultation, communication, and then the implementation of the redesign itself. And of course, to ensure relevance and with the expectation that things change all the time and striving for continuous improvement, make sure you're evaluating at regular points to check whether the redesign worked to actually reduce the psychosocial risks and to maintain its effectiveness. Now, I'm conscious that after all that may still not be super clear what you should be considering or what can effectively be redesigned in the workplace. So these are some key areas where you can consider if redesign is needed. So the culture of your organization and how it runs. So this includes its processes, practices, how teams are structured, how work is allocated. And then there's the equipment, the tools, the systems that support your staff to do their jobs. So this can include things like machinery, technology, information and IT systems. And then there's the potential of redesigning, the human factors, which includes your employees' strengths and development areas, their personality traits, keeping them in mind, their values, their skills, and their knowledge base, and how that connects in with your company, with your organization. The tasks themselves and the physical and psychological demands that are imposed on your employees, and the environment in which your employees work in, so their workspaces, their physical conditions, and their locations. So these things are all essentially up for grabs and able to be redesigned for the purpose of mitigating psychosocial hazards in the workplace. Now, I'm just going to actually quickly throw to Heidi to share her perspective on what the regulators' expectations are when they're looking at the application of controls in the workplace and what's reasonably practicable. So kind of just over quickly to you, Heidi.
Yeah, sure. So I'm sure this is a question that is on a lot of employers' minds in terms of what's reasonably practical. And I suppose when we're looking at work design as a control measure, or work redesign, I should say, we're not saying that there has to be a complete redesign of every single role within an organisation and a complete review of everything. We're really talking to a notion of reasonably practical, that what is feasible to address just aspects of the work that are stresses. And when we're looking at that, if we go back to that hierarchy of control that you were talking about before, Fiona, it's really saying that we're wanting to see that element of change in the nature of the work that is being performed, but not the worker. So those elements of providing resilience training or offering EPA or those types of things would not be considered, I suppose, enough when we're really wanting to look at the nature of the work itself. So, I think organisations need to look at these things from, there will be unique aspects for potentially individual workers, but looking at team structure and how teams organise and also are organised, and then also looking at how different teams within an organisation work and interface together, and those interactions which are really important to consider. And I suppose what I was reflecting on as a really simple, perhaps example, and I'd ask the audience to perhaps reflect within their own organisations, is to consider, in terms of us looking at the element of role clarity, could you as an organisation just think about now, is there any place, if we were to come out and sit down and have a meeting, that you could actually produce something that would show a diagram or an explanation of what each team's role and key functions are within your organisation? Okay, so just think about that for a minute. If I'm a new employee that's coming into your organisation and need to understand what the breadth of all the things are that your organisation does, is that actually written down somewhere that you could easily find? Because that will lend itself to somebody understanding where they fit within and who they interact with within an organisation. So in terms of reasonably practicable, would it be reasonable and practicable to have something, that was written down or documented that could help explain how different roles and functions work together within an organisation? I would think so. Another element of reasonably practicable, we talk about lack of reward and recognition. For a team leader, such as myself here, or other line managers or managers, that ability to just be able to give people some recognition and reward and praise for the good work that they're doing doesn't cost, anything in terms of people's resource or allocation, but that actual element of providing praise, reward on a regular and valued part of people's job role is going to be an element of being able to show that you're actually addressing that as a risk. So if we were to come out and ask workers, do you receive, regular praise or reward for the work that you do, we'd like them to answer yes to those types of questions. So in those elements of looking at what's reasonably practicable, there are some quite simple things that can be done to address some of those psychosocial hazards.
Yeah, thank you for that, Heidi. I think that's kind of a key component there, is redesign doesn't have to be super complex. And it can be, simple little changes that reap quite significant rewards.
Yeah. And the main thing is that we're looking for consultation, and consultation that actually from a redesign perspective that is involving the staff, not just a send me through your ideas, and the business will make a decision. So they need to be involved because they are the people who do the work. They know what the hazards are in being addressed.
That's perfect. We have, one of our case studies will be talking very much about that. But before we actually dovetail into the actual case studies themselves, I'm just going to do a super quick refresher for those of you who might be joining us for the first time. Before we start talking about the specific psychosocial hazards and how redesign might apply to them. So I'll just very quickly reintroduce this slide again. So this is a list of the common psychosocial hazards as listed in the new Code of Practice. So we have high job demands, low job control, poor support and resources, lack of role clarity, poor organisational change management, inadequate reward and recognition, poor organisational justice, traumatic events or material, which also includes vicarious trauma, remote or isolated work, poor physical environment, violence and aggression, bullying, harassment, conflict or poor workplace relationships and interactions, and low job security. Now, the darker blue boxes indicate a hazard where the presence of or too much of this hazard is what can potentially cause psychological harm. And the lighter blue indicate hazards where the lack of or too little of is what has the potential to cause psychological harm. Now, if you'd like more specific details about each of these hazards, you can either refer to the Code of Practice or you can re-watch webinar 1 from this series, which can be found on SafeWork SA's YouTube channel. But I just wanted to make sure we're all using that same common language when we're, or understanding this common language when we're using it as we're talking through the case studies. Okay. So the first case study I'll share with you today was implemented in the Australian Taxation Office, so the ATO. Now, I'm sure all of you are aware of what they do, given a big slice of your pay each year is paid to them. But the ATO is one of the biggest federal government agencies with about 20,000 workers. And what they recognised post-COVID was the level of burnout and fatigue their employees were experiencing. And a significant contributor was the high level of job demands. So their aim was to increase well-being and productivity through better use of time. And there were 4 strategies they implemented to address high job demands that were really centered around redesign as a control. So the first initiative was around facilitating more opportunities for deep work. Now, for those of you who might be unfamiliar with that term or the research around that, when they reference deep work, they're meaning a flow state. So a flow state is describing state of mind when a person is completely focused and immersed on a single task or activity. And when people are in this state, they don't experience any thoughts about themselves or their performance. They're just totally in the zone and super productive. And it takes about 10 minutes of complete focused attention to reach this state. And once in flow, it can last from about 30 minutes to even up to 2 hours, assuming there are no disruptions. So with this premise in mind, the work schedule of teams were redesigned where alternating teams were allocated 2-hour time blocks where there are no meetings. So no phone calls, no chats, just deep thinking space focused on doing uninterrupted work. Now, the second strategy involved redesigning the culture of meetings. And this involved putting some really clear structures around how meetings were run and agreeing the purpose and outcomes beforehand. Now, the third initiative involved a redesign of communication and email etiquette with the aim of reducing traffic and distraction. And the fourth initiative was aimed at redesigning the culture and focusing on early intervention and care. So the ADO implemented regular one-on-one check-ins for staff with their managers to discuss their concerns, workload, and mental health matters openly. Now, in just 6 weeks, so this was an initial trial. So in just 6 weeks, they measured an average decrease of burnout by 15%. It was 21% reduction in work demands, 21% reduction in reported mental load, and a 13% reduction in fatigue. And 34% of participants who participated in the initial trial reported an increase in productivity, and 45% reported an increased ability to focus. And I can also share that I did a little bit of homework on this one and contacted a few people I know in the ATO, and they personally vouched for how helpful these initiatives were because they've actually rolled it out throughout the department. So total hats off to the ATO for these initiatives and that deserving winner of the Health and Wellbeing Strategy Award issued by ARI, the Australian Human Resources Institute. I believe that was last year. Now, the second case study I will talk through is about Great Southern Bank and their mitigation of poor organisational change through redesign. Now, as part of a major rebrand, the Great Southern Bank needed to realign their company's culture and values, and they recognised that if they did not do this well, it could really adversely affect the mental health and wellbeing of their staff. You know, the Great Southern Bank had been around for 75 years, and so they had a really ingrained culture and value set already. So to get on the front foot and deter the potential negative effects of change, and instead garner the buy-in of staff, the bank adopted an approach where they could co-create the new brand and cultural values together. So essentially, they were redesigning how they approach change management with co-design. And the process involved them crowdsourcing ideas from employees, voting on new company names and visual designs, as well as extensive communication to keep the workforce informed and engaged. So very different from the typical process of ideas coming from the top and employees given the opportunity to provide feedback, or in some cases, just the illusion of consultation. So the qualitative feedback from staff showed that employees felt more aligned with the brand and organisational values, and employee engagement scores post the rebrand actually reached the highest score it ever received. So they got a 4.47 out of 5 for their engagement scores post this activity, highest ever. And there were also significant improvements in productivity, with the average amount of time taken for a home loan application to be approved decreasing by more than half compared to the 2 years prior. So that's an amazing achievement from that point of view as well. I'm sure we've all either personally experienced or know someone who has experienced organisational change gone wrong and the impacts it can have on health and wellbeing. So again, total hats off to the Great Southern Bank for their approach, and they were worthy winners of ARI's Best Organisational Development and Change Strategy Award last year as well. Now to the third case study at the Attorney General's Department, focusing on mitigating poor leadership, poor workplace interactions and lack of role clarity. Now, historically, and even now in some organisations, people's performance was based on their technical ability to deliver and not their people or relationship building skills. And I'm sure many of you in this webinar today are aware of, if not have personally experienced, the manager who was promoted due to being amazing in their technical skills, but not necessarily in their desire or even interest to lead people. So to ensure people with the right skills and motivations moved into people management roles, and in recognition that there was a lack of understanding around behavioural expectations of employees and managers, AGD consulted with staff to develop a set of behavioural expectations. So in acknowledgement of a pre-existing set of behaviours that all executives were to uphold across the entire public sector, these behaviours were used to be cascaded down to all levels in the department. And in recognition that these behaviours needed to be transparent and contributing to attract the right job and person fit, a new job and person specification template was created which highlighted not only the knowledge and technical requirements of the role, but also the behavioural expectations. And then following suit, the performance review and development process was updated to include the specific behaviours from individuals' job and person specs to allow for performance feedback on behaviours and not just tasks. Now, the training offerings were then also realigned to the behaviours, and employees who needed additional training and upskilling to perform in their roles could refer directly to behavioural competencies in their job and person spec to relevant training. And then employees with the desire for progression and development could refer to the behaviours in their classification above and proactively undertake training to upskill in those areas in preparation for promotion activities or acting opportunities. And then also following suit, leadership programs were also designed to link in with the corresponding management behaviours so that employees identified as showing interest in people management roles and were exceeding in their behavioural expectations at their current level could also be nominated for leadership programs as well. So using a systems thinking approach, this initiative, which initially started as, behavioural expectations and giving managers the ability to have good performance conversations, it really evolved into a redesign of how they attracted talent, managed that talent, rewarded that talent, and recognised and promoted that talent as well. And this contributed to a huge shift in culture where people started to value people skills and not just technical competence. It also contributed to reduction in conflict, resentment, and dissatisfaction with how recruitment decisions were being made, alongside managers feeling better equipped to have performance conversations about behaviour. Now, these initiatives aren't new or rocket science, but I guess 10 years ago in a government department made up of professions which highly value technical competence, this was a pretty huge shift. Now, I must confess now that I was personally involved in this case study, so no bias or anything, but hats off to us for winning the Australian Psychological Society Workplace Excellence Award in the category of organisational design for this one. Now, I'm conscious that I've gone through these case studies in a bit of depth, but Heidi will now share some other examples of redesign controls with you as well. Oops.
Okay, thank you. Excellent. No, if you want to just start by flicking back at the previous slide there.
Oh, yeah, sure.
That's great. So in terms of, we broadly looked a little bit at some of the processes that an organisation could go through in looking at redesign, and I will refer you to some of the resources towards the back end of this webinar today to give you some ideas of where to go to get information about how to do this process. But I just wanted to talk you through a case study that I was involved in and looked at redesign of a particular work group, work roles as well. Once again, we just want to ensure that we're coming from a place or position where we're acknowledging that both psychological and physical elements of work can impact on people's psychological health and well-being as well. So we need to ensure that we're addressing physical elements. So looking at this scenario as an organisation, I know in the previous webinars we've talked about, the process of risk management in looking at doing a risk assessment. Organisations might be using a type of tool where there might be surveying staff to sort of identify and look at some trends as to where staff feel that there are hazards that are available. So you would be going through that process of looking for those trends and then be in a position of maybe wanting to have some, it might be some team-based discussions, it might be some focus groups within your organisation, or it could even be just some one-on-one catch-ups and really having some discussion to sort of flesh out and gain a more richer understanding of what are some of the factors that are causing those stresses within your workplace. So if we want to flick to a slide here, I'll sort of take you through to a particular type of job role that we looked at and looked at all of those factors in looking at reducing really both physical but predominantly some factors which we're looking at a job demand perspective and were causing certainly quite a bit of strain and stress on the workers. So with this particular job role here, it was that of a service technician role. So just to give you the context of what the role involved, workers were going about visiting multiple sites within a day and performing servicing work on equipment and plant. Fundamentally, their work van was their office. They didn't really have a home base. They would take those work vans home with them, and they didn't really have a central place of employment that they would necessarily come to each day. So So they were very independent and they worked in a very solitary way. So they had to be quite dependable and independent workers. Their work involved that they might have to be driving sometimes for up to 4 hours a day in that van. Obviously, if you can think a service technician, they're carrying around some heavy tools or equipment. They're needing to get down into some sort of awkward positions. If you can imagine lying on some, pretty hard or uncomfortable surfaces to get access to different parts of machinery and plant. But other elements of the way that the work was organised were that the service technicians were time tracked on the job. There was a monitoring system looking at them, how long they were spending at a job, and they were tracking that through a tablet that they used, where they were sort of logging information on the tablet and needing to look up information. They had to, from a perspective of being quite knowledgeable, they really needed to know the equipment that they were servicing, and there was a lot of variety around the scope of work that they might need to service. So they really had to know their way around different pieces of plant and equipment quite well. Another element of the job in terms of how work was allocated to them, it was through an auto dispatch system. So if you can imagine that you were out on the road, you just completed a job, then you might have to wait, or you might automatically pick up the next job and need to go off to that location. So just moving on to the next slide now, just wanted to tease out some of those work design factors that we can look there. So if we're looking at just the physical tasks that the workers were doing, we could see that there were definitely some of those physical factors that were hazards that could cause strain. So we could look at the, sustained awkward postures that they needed to develop. There was some awkward lifting that was heavy, and you can imagine in the van seats that perhaps the suspension wasn't all that great in the vans, and that maybe the seating itself might have been quite uncomfortable. So we're sort of looking at a bit of an unpleasant work environment in comparison to perhaps us who sit in an office chair all day in a nice heated and air-conditioned environment. The tools that they needed to use, they predominantly use like manual tools to perform their work. I mentioned before about the suspension in the van perhaps not being well. But if you can also imagine where their van is their office, they had a tablet that they needed to use, their log, their activities on. They were within that van cabin sort of environment, so everything was sort of they reached for was from their seated driving position. And they also said that the tablet that they used, where they needed to search for information about different pieces of equipment that they were servicing and looking up part componentry, it was actually difficult to navigate through different screens and technologies. So I'm just wondering if you can perhaps reflect, perhaps in your own line of work, thinking about the complications that sometimes the setup of, software that we have to use throughout the day can make things a little bit more difficult. In terms of the actual environment that they were doing work in, they were obviously outdoors quite a bit of their time, having to work on hard or uneven surfaces, and they did work into the evenings, which brought the complexities of working at night time with poor lighting, colder weather, and more unpleasant working conditions. So the workers, in talking about some of their issues with the way that the work was designed with the auto dispatch system, said that sometimes they could be working somewhere down south, maybe let's say Christie's Beach or Seaford, and then on the auto dispatch system, they could get logged to suddenly go out and do a job at Paraka or at Parrotfield Gardens as their next job. And sometimes they might even pass one another on the road, or they knew that there were maybe another worker that was out in those northern fields, but yet they were tracked and needed to travel those greater distances. So there was this element of sentiment of feeling that perhaps this auto dispatch system, it wasn't actually utilising their skills as efficiently as they could because of the great lengths of time travelling between job to job. Acknowledging that they also had KPIs that they were trying to meet in order that, their time on the job and how fast they could get through the jobs that were allocated to them. There were some elements of looking at people that were working into more of a night shift or into the evening shifts, and the way that their rosters were started, where they might have been working into a night shift, but then they needed to cycle back to an early shift with only a day's break in between. They spoke to the elements that the technical information that they needed to look at was sometimes hard to look up on this tablet software. It was very difficult to find that correct information. And they spoke to this constant conversation from their line managers that was really focused on meeting KPIs. So they've often said that it seems like all the conversations that they were having were around KPIs all the time. But beyond that, there was very infrequent contact from their line managers. So the other thing, in terms of the people themselves, they were in a trade. They were predominantly male. They did receive regular training in how to service, different pieces of equipment. And so on. They would come in for a centralised training program, but then they were also considered, they really highly valued as individuals the customer service that they gave to the industries that they supported. So they really took a lot of pride in the work that they did. So these were the design issues that we looked at the work job. So Fiona, if you just want to flick to the next slide, we'll talk through some of the solutions.
Sure.
So what we looked at in terms of redesign, so we looked at the cabin environment and the I suppose the software on the tablet that was being utilised. So there was some changes that were looked at in terms of just improving the van seating, given that it was an element of their job that they really sat in their vans for a lot of the day, and it was really their office environment. There were some changes that were looked at in terms of the software that was on the tablet itself, so that there was, I suppose, a redesign in making that a little bit more user-friendly to operate in, so that they could look up information more easily. Supervisors were given, I suppose, that premise that they needed to be checking in more regularly with their staff, and just that really supportive check-in, not conversations around KPIs and those things being met, but really checking in if there was any, further support that the workers needed. Did they need any extra pieces of tools or equipment that might need to be brought to them, and just really giving them that, I suppose, emotional support throughout the day. There were some elements in terms of the environment that they needed to work in, and the tools that they used as well, by some giving workers more flexibility about different types of lighter power tools that they could be using, kneeling pads or lying pads that they could lie down on, and also some extension poles. Fiona, could I just ask you to mute yourself? I've just got a little bit of feedback maybe coming through. Thank you, that's better. So one of the elements also that they talked around this aspect of KPIs was around that some jobs were quite complex that they needed to deal with, and took a lot more time than sort of average servicing jobs that they went out to. So there was an element of a new code that was developed for more difficult or complex jobs, so that workers felt that they could attribute the additional time that they were spending on work, which might seemingly be detracting from their overall KPIs. They were able to acknowledge that there were jobs that were far more complex to do, and more not detracting from their overall stats. There was some elements of looking at some of that technical information being more accessible. That sort of factored into the tablet software redesign, but also just in I suppose some overall organisation of how things were stored. And where the training that these technicians came in and often were just attended training, they were actually given opportunities to actually share some of their own valued experience and knowledge in providing some sort of quick tips to other technicians when they all came together. So this made them feel more valued as workers, and that they were sort of part of the solution, not necessarily just being taught to from the trainers at the organisation as such. The auto dispatch system, there were some changes there in that there were some elements of, I suppose, some human monitoring of the dispatch system. So they were able to look at where these technicians were located in a day, and if it made sense that somebody might be picking up a job that could be, factor in, maybe a 45-minute drive to get to the others, they could make some shifts to that so that it did make, so that people weren't having to spend as much time travelling. And there was also a review of their roster system to look at how people were changing from shift patternings, etc., to give them, if they had more successive sort of night shifts or late evening shifts, that they weren't immediately going back to an early start in their shift structure. So if we want to move on to some other elements of case studies or types of factors that we're talking about, Fiona, I'll get you to move on to the next slide. As Fiona mentioned before, high job demands certainly is one of the areas or topics that we see in terms of a psychosocial hazard, which most of us are acknowledging, and I can see some chat in the boxes coming up about high demands as well. But we really need to, I suppose, consider that there's lots of different factors that can play into high demands being present. So there can be just that incongruent element of there's more work coming in than maybe resources that we've got allocated at a particular time, and that we need to look at, prioritising that work. But also, I suppose there can be elements, as I have written on the slide here, of just people actually being given effective training in knowing how to do their job. Sometimes it cannot be evident, maybe the systems or processes that should be followed in completing a particular work task. There could be some particular tools or software programs that people need to access, and sometimes our training can be showing people an overview of that, but not actually ensuring that people really understand, given some different complexities of the work, what they need to do. So I have a point there of really considering about going beyond just the induction checklist of showing people, this is where to go, this is what to do, this is who to interact with. It's really considering on, are you actually giving people, effective training so that the demand of the job, that they're not having to use up so much of their cognitive time just trying to find where information is. We also want to look at, as we've, I suppose, previously mentioned, in terms of the systems and the equipment that we use, is it really fit for purpose? I'm sure if I asked any of you of the audience, you're probably nodding your heads right now thinking that there might be a particular software system that you have to use which is clunky or it doesn't quite meet your needs. But it's really looking at, well, what really could be doing. This is maybe affecting many people in the organisation and affecting overall performance of the organisation, let alone the stresses and strains that it's impacting on your work staff as well. So looking at those, is it congruent? Is it really supporting effective work practice? Then we've got elements of looking at excessive working hours, and this is something that I think really needs to be considered in terms of managers actively being seen to be monitoring and addressing patterns of excessive work hours. So consider yourself, consider your staff, or maybe even reflect yourselves on your own work habits. How many people here would be working after hours, taking work home with them to complete work? Now, it might be something that you actually, from an individual worker perspective, like to do, because maybe at home, maybe it's a quieter work environment. You can have some that sort of space to really consider some work. That you work with an employer or a boss that is quite flexible in letting you take time off for that time that you have done in your after hours work. But there's also an element of considering, well, then what is really reasonable additional hours? For those of us who might work in a position where your staff might be salaried, there's often a clause in our job description that talks about, that you work your set work hours, and then potentially any reasonable additional hours might be considered in play. I suppose I would reflect and say, well, are we as an organisation actually monitoring what those additional hours look like? How many additional hours? Are we actually asking those questions when we're having our check-ins with staff and actually trying to moderate those and mitigate the risk of people getting burnt out from doing too many additional hours outside of our usual work roles? And the last point I've got there is really, I suppose, in that, resilient organisation perspective. We talk about resilience engineering, and it's really looking ahead to forecast and plan for periods of high demand and looking at steps that could be taken to ensure that workers aren't getting burnt out or placed on excessively high demands for long periods of time. So whilst we would like potentially, is there an ability to flex other staff within the organisation into a specific team during those periods to look at more additional staff? Can we deprioritise non-essential work and make sure that's actively communicated to ensure that we can help meet those job demands? And also looking at just reallocating work to other people in an organisation so that we're really spreading the load. But it's really, I suppose, being seen to be having those conversations and consulting with staff so that you really feel like you've got an idea of where people are at any sort of given time within a work period. So if we just move on to our next slide. So another element which is quite often brought up is really looking at low job control. So these are jobs that there might be very little flexibility in perhaps how a job is maybe allocated to us, or very little decision-making latitude in really how a job might physically be performed. There's, if we can certainly look at jobs that are in more of a production sort of environment where there's, production lines where people have got a set task, that there's not a lot of flexibility in what you do and how you go about doing it. So I suppose there are elements of looking at, in different organisations, looking at how work might be assigned to different workers within a team, and looking at a way of maybe having a bit more of a collaborative job assignment process, not leaving it maybe to, a team to determine, who's going to do what sort of task, but looking at some sort of, I suppose, perceived fairness and that sort of organisational justice in that dissemination of work across teams. We could look at, I suppose, also the involvement of staff in some decision-making latitude about how the work could be done if possible. So are there some elements that you can give the autonomy to the workers to ensure that they can actually make some decisions about how they do it, how they, set up the environment to perform a particular task? We also want to look at appropriate levels of supervision. Sometimes we'll see environments where staff feel that there is maybe an excessive level of oversight or an element of decision making, that the way that a job is framed up, that a supervisor or line manager is having decision making authority over a work task, which really, if you looked at the competence of the staff, their skills and so on, that they're actually quite capable of making some of those decisions themselves. And it's only in a very small, more nuanced cases that you might want a line manager or supervisor to be stepping in and assisting in making those decisions for them. So those types of environments where people might feel that they have very low control because the supervisor is injecting themselves more into the work that they're doing could be mitigated by understanding what's the skill mix of your staff, what sort of decision-making latitude, do they have the skills to, and considering what that level of supervision may look like. And then the other thing is just, in some jobs where, it could be a call center environment or an area where people just really, they're just doing the same task over and over again. are there ways that you could inject them or ask them to be involved in decision making that just relate to other elements of work? It could be more social aspects of the work, or other sort of team building or team planning days, where you're just really inviting them so that they feel valued and that they have some type of autonomy in the way that work is structured in general. So if we want to move on to another slide here, obviously there are many different types of job demand elements. We've talked about those different types of psychosocial hazards in the workplace. We've spoken to some elements of looking at a lack of reward or recognition within an organisation. From my feedback and talking with other practitioners in the space, it doesn't have to be a big shiny reward, some sort of monthly reward or sort of element of recognition. It can just be a line manager just giving a really concerted thank you and appreciation for people's hard effort of getting a particular report done, or getting a particular body work, or just producing just really good work, or staying back that little bit later to get something completed on time. People just want to be seen and their efforts valued. So I suppose the element there is it doesn't have to be something really shiny and flashy that goes on. Fiona, I'm just wondering, do you have any other examples of other, sort of reward and recognition programs, or anything else around some of the other dot points that we had on the slide here?
I always have plenty of commentary to add, Heidi, but I'm also conscious of time, and I'm also conscious that we've got lots of questions coming through, and we haven't gotten to the end of the actual presentation component yet. So I'm thinking we might just move on, if that's okay.
Absolutely, not a problem.
Oh.
Yep, so we'll get on to this slide. So once again, from our perspective, we really want to see that conversation and that consultation with staff, that we are seeing, we're identifying what the elements are that are causing them stress or strain. So there can be a quite methodical, systematic process. And as I said, we have some resources that we'll share in a few more slides that can support you in your journey down this. But I wanted to present just a really simplified way of getting to the crux of some of these issues. And this model here, it's called the 4Ds model. Some of you might be aware of it if you've ever followed their human and organisational performance, the HOP community. They talk about this model, and it's a really easy way to really get to the crux of what's giving people the most angst or strain at work. So I'll just quickly talk you through it, but then I thought as an audience exercise, we could actually use our Slido slide and actually get you to answer some of these questions and see what we came up with. So the first point here is, the 4Ds relate to dumb, difficult, dangerous, and different. And if you concerted your efforts in asking your staff about these 4 key things, I think you would know a really good place to start with your journey in looking at job redesign. Some of them will be difficult, but there's sometimes some really quick, easy solutions that could also be put in place if you're looking at some of these elements. So dumb is really looking at just what are those tasks that you do that just seem completely unnecessary, that don't really add value to the work, that just seem to be a task that you need to do that you don't really see the tangible benefit of actually doing. Difficult could be a highly complex task. It could be emotionally demanding. It could be physically demanding work. So it's probably the task that most people either put to the side and leave to the very end. They'd rather do all the easier things, or it's the thing that really takes up most of their time. Then we've got dangerous. So things that are a real threat to safety. So, it could be working in a really unpleasant, hostile work environment. If you think of maybe some of our frontline workers, hospital staff, and other people working in sometimes some retail areas as well, some outward-facing retail that are dealing with aggressive customers and clients. If you're looking at our social services industry as well, there are ways that if you're particularly looking at lone workers, perceiving that they're being physical, their safety is being threatened, look at those types of tasks. And then lastly, we've got things that are different, okay, things that could trip you up. Okay, so think of those unexpected things that come up from time to time in your work that are just out of the ordinary, that are a little bit different, and that you have to pay a lot more attention to. And maybe there's not a roadmap or a procedure in how to deal with those particular scenarios. So they're the 4 Ds. So I'm actually wondering now, I think Fiona is going to bring up the Slido slide. And we were just wondering if you want to grab out your mobile device and hold it up and scan the Slido imagery there, and just go through and just think about what's one unnecessary work task that is part of your role. All right, so just take a minute and just think about what's something that you just think is really dumb to do, okay? Real time waster. I can see people are typing there. Scanning notes, that's a good one. Yep, multiple reports on the same issue. Duplication of finance data. Yep, I can definitely see that one. Yep, repeating dates in a different system. I can see a lot of sort of data system related things with maybe computer software programs, unnecessary meetings. Yep, we talked about that. That was what Fiona was talking about in her example. Yep, manually entering data. That's another software issue, isn't it? Monthly reporting. Duplication of data, poor technology. Yeah, I'm seeing a bit of a trend here.
The list could really go on, couldn't it?
Data, duplication, and reports. Yes.
Mm.
So we're definitely seeing a bit of a theme. All right, that's great. Now we've got another question. Yeah. So if we've got a chance, you can finish that one. If you now go to the next slide, there should be a new question that comes up. Think about one thing that is really complex or demanding in your task. Sorry, a demanding task that relates to your job. Is there something? So it could be something that's cognitively quite demanding. It could be physically or emotionally quite demanding. Have a think about what they are. Hard conversations. Yep, absolutely. I can see some compliance monitoring. That can be quite a complex task. Stakeholder management, relationships. So it's a lot of those, I can see interactions of, people interactions. Yep, that's coming through. Incident investigations we've got. That's interesting. I'm interested in that. Stakeholder relationships, people management, performance management. Yep. Fiona, how does that sit with you? Would that resonate with some of the feedback that you see from people that you interact with?
Yeah, absolutely. There's, I think, the uncertainty, the challenging relationships, conflict, confrontation, those are the emotional demands, part of it. And I think sometimes a lot of the, what people view as a demanding task, I think what's really important to recognize there is a task that some other people view as really challenging and demanding. For other people, it's really easy. So it also depends on people's personalities and strengths and And it's kind of an acknowledgement that as people, we thrive in different tasks, different activities, and different environments as well. So I think that's actually something that's really important to be mindful of, is what works for me might not necessarily work for you, because you're a different person as well. And that's just another added level of complexity that we're having to deal with when we're working with people.
Yeah, that's true. And that, I mean, I think talking to those points, there's that element which is another field which is very similar to job design, is looking at job crafting for individuals, and I suppose really being able to play to people's strengths, because some people will have certain strengths in certain areas, whilst for others, not. So that's another sort of aligned conversation that we could have. But yeah, I can definitely see some similarities. A lot of that sort of performance managing, having difficult conversations with people. Yeah, we've got covering absenteeisms. Yep, that absolutely increases workload on people for sure. Briefing senior managers. Yes, lots of reporting and data. Dealing with data seems to be some common threads. I'm sure we've all dealt with systems where we're having to extract some data out of one system and put it into another system, and it would be great if the two systems could just talk to one another, or there was just one system maybe. So if anybody who works in IT here, take that feedback. All right, we've got one more question. So looking at that dangerous element, what is a task that poses a risk to your safety or well-being, something that you would consider dangerous? Now, it may not necessarily maybe be your personal safety, but is it in your team or the work teams that you work with? Have a think about that. Long hours, yep, they can definitely be an issue. Lack of clarity and high-risk activities.
So grey areas, so lack of clarity again. Yeah.
Unmanaged poor behaviours, yes.
That workload, high job demand.
Recruitment is dangerous. Is that looking at the future dealing with someone, or I'm not sure what you mean there. We've got vicarious trauma there. Hazardous chemicals, dust exposure. Yep, it's good to see that people are identifying that as dangerous work. Yep, workload and demand. Yep, so we've got bullying behaviour. That ties into maybe that that perhaps lack of those individuals being managed. Feeling overwhelmed by continuous demands. Traffic management. Yep, that's definitely a significant risk.
Discrimination we have there as well, and
confrontational conversations. Yes.
Yeah.
Isolated travel. Yes.
I think this is interesting. Seasonal high demand. So as in it's not constant, but there are peaks of. So I think there was a question about that in the that we can attempt at answering as well later, Heidi.
Yeah.
Okay. So again,
Great.
similar, like lots of different things, but also lots of trends as well, I think we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So we've just got one more. If we flick over to our last. Okay. So think about tasks that are unexpected. Those tasks that are just, they come out of left field. They're not the usual things that are part of your role, or something that you might have to deal with. Can you give an example of what something would be there that's just different, you have to think about it a lot harder. I can see lots of people typing here. Reactive advice, yes, responding to something.
Yeah, good one. Covering staff who leave and aren't replaced.
Site visits for compliance inspections. I wonder who wrote that.
What do you take of that, Heidi?
Doing work of others. Okay, so we've got sort of this covering of staff, like so picking up perhaps when, staff are maybe on unexpected leave. Yep, picking up colleague works. Staff suicide, yes, that would be very difficult. Critical incident support, absolutely. So no, that's great. So for those of you who are, listening in terms of looking for how to respond in these unexpected situations, there's a whole area called resilience engineering, which is around a concerted effort to try to predict, plan and prepare for those more unexpected circumstances so that people know how to respond in those situations. So taking away from the sort of day-to-day usual work activities, it's really focused on what are the ifs of work that could be performed, and really ensuring that your staff know how to respond in those different areas. So there are definitely some fields, some industries that do this all the time and respond to that, but it's really a good lesson that we could introduce into the more mainstream office environments, organisations, in having to flex in those periods of unexpected things coming up. Well, thank you for your involvement there with those questions. I hope you found that a little bit engaging to reflect on, perhaps that you're not alone with some of the issues that you're currently dealing with in your own role. So on our slide here, we've got some resources and some different tools that you could use that could help give you some guidance around work design. So at the top of our list here, we have, if you've not been to SafeWork Australia's website and looked at their good work design page, they have a really good, thorough principles of good work design handbook, which you can download. We also have in SafeWork New South Wales, they have designing work to manage psychosocial risks. And that's another really good resource tool that talks about, in terms of looking at all of the psychosocial hazards that we're featured in our legislation, really unpacking those and looking about how you can go about designing that work. We've also got there, also through the Centre for Work Health and Safety in New South Wales, have a psychosocial hazard work redesign tool. So some of the imagery that was in this presentation has been taken from that tool, and it really talks more through that process of how you would go through planning the delivery of consulting with your staff, gaining feedback, and actually has a nice sort of workbook at the end of it that you can put information into, and has some sort of suggested examples. There are some worked examples available on their website as well to give you some practice, but it very much depicts kind of a process that you could go through in using that tool. We have obviously the model code of practice, managing psychosocial hazards at work, and for you, in terms of knowing that obviously here in South Australia there will be a code of practice that will be coming out shortly. So just watch this space in terms of looking for that. There is also some resources in psychosocial risk assessments available on SafeWork SA's website, which you can go to there. If you just type in psychosocial into our search bar, you'll be able to go into the link page there. And obviously SafeWork SA ourselves, we obviously have an advisory service that we can provide some assistance to staff and companies if they need some further assistance. And Fiona, you're here as well.
Right. That really just takes us to the questions component now. So let's see, I'm just going to bring this up. Look, there's a lot of questions, so let me work out why that's not working. Okay, I'm just going to throw it over here. Okay, So looking at the time, we might not have enough time to get through all the questions, but we'll try and keep our answers as concise as possible to get through as many as we can. So shall we jump straight into it, Heidi?
Sure.
All right, so what templates, tools do you recommend to assess workload when a team or worker complains of excessive workload? Are there any templates, tools that you're, I think you were referring to some, were you referring to some before, Heidi, when you were talking about the high job demands slide before?
So there are probably some more complex work demand tools that are available from more like I suppose, a cognitive workload element. I'm coming more from a sort of a human factors kind of ergonomics element in terms of that. But I think in a really, practical sense, it is really that consultation and sitting down with staff to really look at what is the work that's really channeling through into them, and having that conversation around that prioritization of work. What are the elements that provide the that are meeting the organisation's most imminent needs, that need to be addressed, and giving some sort of ranking system to staff. It's also important to, I suppose, consider that if you're going through a long period of, I suppose, excessive workload, are you actually giving maybe that individual or that team an element of shifting through having a period of break, or a period of sort of rest and recovery, just to be able to give them some space to maybe be doing some other tasks which aren't quite in excessive demands, or so on. So there's probably some I know within AGD, Fiona, there are some workload management tools that they use as an organisation as well. I'm not sure if you were involved in any of those.
No, not personally with those ones.
That's right. Yeah.
But I suppose ultimately, you're exactly right, Heidi. Consulting with your worker, understanding, are the expectations that you are placed, expecting of them, placed upon them, are they actually reasonable? And if they were back then, and you've done an assessment, are they now? Has the context actually changed as well? So it's really actually sitting down and understanding, and I suppose almost that redesign component of, are there actually any factors that might have changed the context of work, the complexity of work, that might actually result in workload no longer being feasible for whatever reason? And sometimes that could be as a result of the organizational change and requirements, it impacts that way. And or at other times as well, potentially temporarily, it might be as a result of personal supports or changes with an individual as well, where workload perceptions might actually need to shift a little to provide some leeway.
That's right. And I
Mhm.
think, from my perspective, sometimes, that workload demand can be, as we've seen in the chat, in just doing some of those Slido questions. Sometimes it's the workload itself can be internal systems and processes just not working well. We talked about,
Mhm.
things being, processes being fit for purpose or congruent with nice, efficient work. So, is there an element that can be worked on with an organisation to try to streamline some of those processes so that they do work more effectively, that
Mm,
actually gives people more time to do the work,
mm,
not that things are clunky and actually slowing them down? So I think asking questions, some of that, they can be, in some instances, quite easy fixes,
mm,
making some shortcuts for staff to be able to do their
mm,
work more easily as well. But
mm,
absolutely, consultation with work staff. It might be individual work plans. It might be assisting to make sure that priorities are aligned, because
mm,
maybe what an individual might value as their priorities might be quite different to what the organisation actually wants them to focus on. So really sitting down and
mm,
having those conversations to look at where the priorities are. And of course, if there's scanning out throughout a team to look at, are there pockets of areas where people could actually help and assist for short-term periods as well.
mm. And just adding to that as well, I think sometimes we forget that sometimes a simple task that we can do, um, seems simple enough from a time and task point of view, but it might actually have a real emotional toll on people as well, and the time needed to actually process that and download that afterwards as well takes time that we might not always factor in. So if we're looking at particularly tasks to do with exposure to traumatic material, task itself seems like that will only take 5 minutes for us to, in a prosecutor role, for example, review that data, review the evidence, but the emotional toll and the complexities around that needing to debrief and to decompress, that might not
Yeah.
always be factored in.
Yeah.
So really, when you're assessing workload, that you're actually factoring in all of those things and not just tasks itself.
No, that's a good point.
Okay, let's go to the next one, shall we? Consultation has come up quite a bit. So how do you work through the stigma occurring within organizations so as not to get a biased result? Now, I'm kind of assuming a biased result as in the decision has already been predetermined. Is that how you might read that as well? Only
I
because
don't know. Felix, if you're
maybe
still there, did you want to jump online and just explain that a little bit more?
he might not be. It's okay. Yeah, look,
Did you?
when I suppose I consider stigma in an organization with consultation, it's probably more around skepticism, around the authenticity, and is the consultation genuine? And so people don't actually bother to provide their feedback with the expectation that it's not going to be really listened to anyway. That's how I'm going to read into this question, correct or not? Sorry, Felix. So I suppose with that is how are you going to, in organizations I've worked with, yes, there has always been a precedent where consultation may have not been genuine. However, there really is a authentic and genuine desire now to consult. So how do you change that stigma or that bias that employees might have?
Yeah, I've just read
Yeah.
Felix's
Oh, yeah, he was
clarification there.
okay.
Felix just said, I've met in terms of employees not telling you since they feel stigma around potential backlash from what they're
Right.
saying.
Okay.
Saying in a focus group that they're in with a person that they have a problem with is in the group too. So,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So this is really then about safety of trust in the process. Is what they share actually going to not be held against them and them not have any adverse effects in any way? I mean, firstly, I think whoever the facilitators are of that process really need to uh, build in avenues to protect employees so that they feel confident and comfortable to voice their views. And where I've seen this done really well is how they actually design focus groups, for examples themselves, for managers to be in separate focus groups to employees. Other designs are where there is, as opposed to people speaking out in a group setting, it might just they write their commentary up on the wall and then the facilitator discusses those more broadly as a team. So a person isn't necessarily singled out as such. And other ways, of course, are like anonymous drop boxes or other um, like survey, using technology where people can provide their feedback as well. So, for example, a Slido platform, that's something I actually use quite regularly when I run focus groups um, as well. So people can actually still, within that same setting and very immediately provide their feedback or response to a question that might be posed and feel safe that they're not going to be identified in any way. So there
yeah,
are some avenues that you can build around that.
that's great. And I would definitely back up your comments there around really thinking hard with regard to the types of groups of people that you're bringing together if you are having a focus group session. it would want to be an organisation that there's a lot of robustness and good psychosocial safety, that you would have a team leader or manager in that group with you. Generally speaking, you would always have, I suppose, the same level of individuals in a focused group, so that they're all experiencing that same level of interaction with other staff members, so that they're not speaking about that. And I think that the Slido recommendation, as you've said, so there's sort of anonymous comments being able to be provided in real time is another way. The other element is, of course, just making sure that you acknowledge whoever is facilitating or gathering the information is acknowledging that if anybody wants to come to them personally after, or emailing them with specific concerns, that they have that option to come to them afterwards as well.
Cool. All right, Heidi, I'm conscious of time, so let's fly through a few more, shall we? Will the new version of the hierarchy go into the code of practice in SA? We actually just had a chat about this last week, didn't we, Heidi, with Andrew?
Yes.
So where have we kind of landed with that?
Well, I must admit, I'm not sure if I can actually give a definitive answer on that. I know that the code of practice in its draft form is currently going through some review. It will be coming out very shortly. I know Andrew's there.
And there you go. Andrew's jumped on.
He's the man that can answer that. I might let you jump in.
Yeah, it's just a quick update, really. So we have so at the moment there's a model code that hasn't been approved in South Australia, but it's still guidance for our purpose. And they're already amending that. So the Commonwealth are already amending that model code to have more detail in it, but it's still a broad brush code that fits most jurisdictions across Australia, and everyone's had a bit of input into it. So we've got a little bit of Queensland specific, a little bit of Victorian, a little bit of ours. So what we want to do, we still want to push ahead and have our own code of practice in South Australia. So we're drafting that. We only want examples in that are South Australian specific. So the Commonwealth Code uses stuff like, you work in a Commonwealth agency, these things are happening, and they are different than working in a South Australian government agency or a business. Even businesses are different. So we're still going to have our own. At the moment, it's we have to put through the advisory committee. So we've got a SafeWork advisory committee, and we've got a package ready for a working group within that advisory committee to look at the code. And then once that's done, we'll do a process, and we would hope, subject to all the approvals by the Minister, we will have our own bespoke code of practice in South Australia. And it will certainly be by the end of the year if all goes well.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm not sure we've specifically answered the question as such about whether or not the version of the hierarchy will go into that code of practice, but we're, hopeful, I suppose, to have some sort of iteration of the hierarchy into there.
Sorry, and I completely missed that bit. So with the hierarchy, what we've done is we have the hierarchy is a hierarchy pretty well. It's how you explain the hierarchy, and we're working really hard to have a really good explanation of what the hierarchy looks like in the code, noting that the physical and the psychological are different, but they overlap, and the psychological issues come from the physical quite often. That makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. Shall we just aim for 2 more? I'm conscious of time, but make 2 quick ones, Heidi.
Oh, yes.
Okay, what do you suggest to do if the over workload happens rarely due to some project deadlines? Rest of the time is even and managed well. So I suppose this is around adjusting, resources at specific times. I mean, something that's always worked really well for me, in saying that I've always had, part-timers in my team as well. And that's where I think that there's that flexibility within the team. Is there an opportunity where your part-timers can pick up a few hours during peak hours as well? And so you're not having to necessarily recruit new people in, but it's temporary, and you're providing that opportunity to, I suppose, work a little bit more if they want to. Reprioritizing as well expectations or demands during those times as well. If if that's reasonable. I suppose those are sort of two kind of more practical ways of managing peaks and troughs, I suppose, of workload. Those are the first two that kind of jump to mind, Heidi.
Yeah.
Anything on your end?
I think the aspect and not knowing the particular unique aspects of the organisation that you're talking from, I suppose it's looking at that the length of period of time that overwork is coming to. So if it's just a few weeks or something like that, or if you're talking about a more seasonal period where it might be going on for a few months of overload, you would probably be tackling it a little bit different, but certainly that element of prioritization and really, I suppose, sitting down and planning with your staff how you're going to be dealing with this period of overload, and making sure it's quite clear with them what their expectations are in terms of what's not going to be a priority for them to perform is critical. And of course, just making sure that there might be a need for some planned little bits of respite or just some time away, just for people to be able to rest and recover as well is important to keep them fresh.
Yeah, no, good ones. All right, well, I think really we're just going to jump to this last one, which is, can we get a list of these answers? There are some great comments being made, and just to that is this webinar is being recorded, and it will be made available through SafeWork SA's YouTube channel, so you can always refer back to this question time of the webinar as well.
Right. So once again, those the resources that we had up there, you can find them. Cheryl, I can see that you've made a comment there. Yes, it was the psychosocial hazard risk management redesign tool that we were talking to on our page. So thanks for reinforcing that. But we hope this has been at least a little bit more insight into what work design and work redesign is about, and certainly you can come to SafeWork SA if you want any more information, and Fiana's obviously available as well.
Yes, likewise, same sentiment. I want to thank you all for registering and giving us your very valuable time, and I hope that Heidi and I have been able to increase your understanding of the importance of good work design and how, as a control, it serves to eliminate hazards from the source. Now, if you haven't already, there is a evaluation, so 2 minutes just to complete a Slido poll. As Heidi and I aren't perfect, we are keen to know how we can better the webinar experience for everyone. So if everyone could just take, I think it's really only like a minute to complete it, we would be truly grateful for that. But other than that, conscious of everyone's time, so just enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, thank you. And thanks, Fiana, for doing this webinar with us. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, Heidi.